We got another panel coming up. Laurel, welcome to the stage to lead this next session. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Laurel.
Yeah, let's continue this conversation on equity and sustainability that Paul and Brian kicked off for us earlier. And with that, we have Stephen Honikman from ElectriQ, Ravi Sajwan from Renew Group, and Stefan from Itron, who's going to make his way through the crowd. Thank you, Jason. So let's start with brief introductions of your background and your innovative companies. Thank you.
My name is Getting Power. I can just yell. There we go. My name is Stephen Honikman. I'm with ElectriQ. We make a smart home energy storage system, a smart battery for a home. My first introduction to energy was, and some of my earliest childhood memories were waiting in long gas lines, the energy challenges that we faced as a country in the 70s. And I was always curious, why is that happening? Gave me an interest in sort of global affairs, economics, and I didn't know how weird it was at the time, but I was raised in a solar home. And when I went away to college, my friends at university were like, "Are you like a dirty hippie? What is a solar home?" And I realized that it was actually kind of special to have been raised with this eye on where our energy comes from and how you live within your means from a resource perspective. And that's informed almost everything I've done since then. And I ended up at ElectriQ because the 20 teens, more or less, were spent financing commercial and industrial scale solar projects, third-party financing through PPAs. And the problem with the market at the time, and it remains actually, and this is related to equity, is if you are a project financier, you want to make sure you're going to get paid back. So if you don't have a bond rating, you're not credit worthy, you aren't a good credit risk, you're probably not going to have access to a PPA. And my work in the teens was basically to try and bridge that gap by figuring out how to underwrite likely to pay back, but not credit underwritten yet, projects. In 2017, I live in Santa Barbara. We had a massive wildfire. It took out our transmission grid. And I thought, well, that's really inconvenient. And then a month later, that fire caused a huge debris flow in my town, killed 23 people, $1 billion worth of very expensive real estate where Oprah lives. Her house was fine. But that made me sort of look at myself in the mirror and wonder, well, I feel good about having contributed to sustainability and the spread of solar, but what am I doing to actually make it more resilient? And the people who were most affected by those two back-to-back disasters were actually the people who could least afford, literally and metaphorically, to be exposed to that lack of power. And so I started a little microgrid development company with an eye towards figuring that out, and ElectriQ ended up having one of our preferred batteries that we were installing. And during the pandemic, ElectriQ and my development company were able to come together, and that allowed me to then join ElectriQ. And it's and really one of the key things we're doing there is dealing with this equity issue. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Good. Hello? Oh, perfect. My name is Ravi Sajwan. I'm CEO of Renew Group based out of Singapore. I come and commute between US and Singapore almost every month. I was born and brought up in India, so in my case, there was intermittent water, intermittent electricity when I was growing up. So when I came to US, you could flip the switch and get all these things. It was an amazing experience. When I went back home, we still had to wait for water in the morning or collect water in buckets or whatever. So as we were building our companies, and we have done a lot of different operating companies, we started focusing on the three things which matter to us most and to the villages where we came from in India. So we focused on water, healthcare, and the largest pillar of our company is actually philanthropy. So all the profits we make actually go to our philanthropic foundation. We've been able to take a state in India, which is called Uttarakhand, 12 million people. We are providing water, power to villages where they had never seen any, and women would have to walk 5 to 7 kilometers just to get a bucket of water. We have actually created bicycles to charge batteries, so you can actually run an LED light in your small camp, run a shop after 5 p.m. And so you have these people who had actually never been part of the economic infrastructure become actually a part of it now. So they are very resilient, very smart, very intelligent, but now rather than walking 5 kilometers to get water, they have additional time to actually do other things. So I'll stop there. As the conversation goes on, I'll work through our, what we have done. But our goal always has been how can we give back, but based on operating businesses which actually make money. So we are a very profitable business, all the businesses run, but our focus has been philanthropy, and that's where we are learning and then applying that to our businesses. So.
Yeah, and my name is Stefan Zschiegner with Itron. Actually, a little bit of my background, I actually joined the solar industry in 2010 with First Solar and was in the middle of the scale-up of utility-scale solar in Germany, and North America was just starting at the time. But my role was actually looking for opportunities, how to really help the first wave of solar adoption in India, how to drive multi-purpose or microgrid solutions. We looked at all kinds of things from telecom, electrification to microgrids in the Middle East. So very exciting times in the solar industry, and later on transition into residential solar to really look at like how do you really drive adoption and take the benefits of residential solar already in the middle of 2014-15. We looked at this. And finally, after some detours into digital transformation in the telecom space, I ended up seeing this opportunity in Itron. Like, this is the right time where you really can take the benefits of behind the meter and the needs in front of the meter and really drive this vision forward in a much bigger way. So super excited to be here and talking to you.
Thank you. Equity is top of mind, especially in California with the high rates here. What does equity really mean to you in the context of the energy transition, Stephen?
So equity, and there's a number of different components. It's not an easy, simple answer, but if you break it down from our perspective, it's affordable, sustainable, and resilient access to energy. And each of those have their own aspects that impact the end user, who we want to make sure is a participant in the clean energy transition. In fact, Electric's mission statement, one of the things that is really something I wear with some pride as a electric power flag bearer, is that it's in our corporate mission to make sure that no one is left behind the clean energy transition. And so providing the energy behind the meter, so we make a behind the meter solar microgrid, but having that microgrid be able to support the grid when the grid is on, that's important for the utilities who are, they have a challenge to keep the grid operating. It's this massive machine. They usually get, their fingers, they're just say they're not loved by the end users always. I think there's a lot of discussion at this event about how that's being addressed, and since I know how hard it is, I appreciate what they do. But when the grid is off is the only time the customer is really angry, because suddenly the power is not there. To your point, in the United States, if your power isn't there, that's the issue. The people, from an equity perspective, the people who are most impacted by that either don't have the ability to install their own generator, be it a solar microgrid or a fossil-based generator, but are also then the most unable to participate in the economy because their power is out. So we want to make sure they can participate in the economy, but do so at a price that is at least neutral to what they're currently paying. So that's what our definition of affordability would be. Sustainable is making sure that the communities that participate in these programs that we develop are able to actually be a part of the solution. So peaker plants, as important as they are to maintaining peak load, are often cited in the communities that are most impacted by air pollution. So we want to make sure that the solution we bring to market actually addresses that as well. So that's the sustainability aspect of it. And then ultimately the resiliency aspect, as we've talked about, is if the grid is off, for whatever the reason is, be it a PSPS event or a drunk hits a pole and you have a distribution issue, there's ride-through. And the homeowner, the best calls I get are when a homeowner, lets us know that they didn't even know there had been a power outage. And if that's something that is happening when a low to moderate income community has their kids at home studying because they're trying to do what they can to make sure they have a better future for their kids, and they were able to do that without an interruption, that's when it really is a very real-world example of an equity impact that we're making to that community.
Sorry. So I can just relate to this from what you just described as a project we did in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, we found a village which had literally very high levels of arsenic in water. So the chronic kidney disease hits at ages as young as 12 and 13. And these kids will actually end up on dialysis at some point in time. And so utilities exist there. They have our infrastructure. They provide the water, but it's never clean enough. And part of the reason is because they have intermittent power. So all the filtration systems don't work all the time. So we had to work with the utilities there and provide a machine which runs on a solar power, sits in a temple, because no one is going to mess it up. And we actually use local nuts and bolts to make sure if it breaks down, they can fix it locally. But all the equipment inside was designed by us. So our company designed it. Now, this equipment is actually available in developed countries, Singapore, US, but in that specific case, it runs from solar. The water comes in. People actually collect water from this temple every day in the hope that the future generation of these kids will actually become healthier. So in this case, the equity comes from the fact that you're actually reducing the number of healthcare incidents in kids who we know for sure some of them will actually end up in dialysis at the age of 20. And the other thing it also did was that the utility actually didn't have to go and ask for any additional aid. Because one of the things about countries like this is they have no money. You talk about utilities and companies not having credit rating here. There, the whole country doesn't have a rating. Forget all the people. And there are 20 million people. And Sri Lanka is just an example of what we did because we were helping a foundation there. But we are trying to replicate this model in other parts of the world. So we have done something very similar in Cambodia. We are doing it in India in a very massive scale. So our thought process is more than 50% of the world's healthcare issues are actually waterborne diseases. So if you don't fix water, you can't fix healthcare. And if you fix healthcare and you get people and the economic infrastructure, now they demand healthcare. So you got to solve both problems at the same time. So obviously, we think without electricity, you can't make things work, so you need that for sure. But without water, you can't live, and you can't grow food. So if you want to capture the whole ecosystem or what we call a circular economy, you need electric, you need water, you need food, and you need healthcare. So we are trying to focus on things where we have some expertise, not a lot, and then we work with a lot of partners to help us develop this stuff along the way.
Yeah, so these are great stories in terms of really what is happening on the ground with engaging with the communities that you both are explaining. And from our perspective, we are kind of looking at our role more as the technology provider behind this to really enable that. And we recognize that we really in the past often are just looking more at the technical problem to solve and not holistically at all the stakeholders that need to get engaged. And if you look at this transformation that needs to happen, we always feel that we basically recognize that the need for connectivity and data is a key foundation to actually drive and enable the decisions and these use cases that you're describing here. So with this in mind, we actually did put in place, and there's a lot of hurdles to actually get access to the data, connect, and also make them available. We're seeing in a lot of companies still that we face silos of sharing the data from one side to the other. It's a big cost, and this cost is an inhibitor to drive progress, engaging with the consumer team and actually work on these end projects that we all want to work on that you guys are talking about. So with this in mind, we actually over the 3 years ago, in our side, we really recognized what is really Itron's role in this. We established an additional product line to really see how do we basically look at data and data ecosystem as an enabler and recognize that companies like SEW, that community engagement companies like yours and these initiatives is that we need to help you to do your job better. How do we provide better data availability, data access to AMI data, but other data, bring them together, and also make available next generation data that we talked about this morning in the different presentations with the next generation infrastructure.
Thank you. And Ravi, you mentioned capital challenges. How exactly do you go about getting through those challenges?
That's a tricky one. So one of the problems we always face is who's going to fund this. So we have an inside conversation. So our companies, when they generate money, we put in our foundation and we build the products and we'll actually deploy them. But then what we do is we create what we call a zero profit charity model. So the idea is, if I'm giving you something which is going to cost me a penny, you give me a penny. So a liter of water, for example, I can process for 1 penny or 1.5 pennies. And I can get that money back from the user. And what the user is doing is not giving back to me, they're putting in a kiddie fund. And the main reason for that money is not to tell us that we need it, is to make sure they're involved in the process. So what we found fascinating was people, instead of putting 1 penny, put actually 5. Because they realize the value it creates for them on a day-to-day basis. And where we thought we actually broke the mold was, as Stefan pointed out, was the data connection. So one of the fundamental problems you run into is, if I don't know what the customer is doing and how they're using it, I lose all sight of that equipment. So with SCW, we partnered about, I think it was about 4 years ago, and they created a very unique OTA over their module for our product. So we have a Singapore office which is looking at equipment in Marshall Islands, in a bunch of places in India, in villages, and in Sri Lanka, and we know a month in advance when one of the machines is actually going to break down, and that was all because of SCW. So for us, it was customer connect is important for utilities here. For us, it was just knowing whether equipment is actually going to work for a longer time. So we actually improved the equipment quite a bit just based on the data we were receiving from the SCW platform. And that made a huge benefit to the customers, which in this case are communities, and us as providers, because we are trying to reduce the cost to actually deploy more, basically.
Yeah, to lay on to that, so I think one of the key things from when we look at this is we had done it kind of relates here, we've done a study a few years back at Itron, and we looked at the impact of time of use rates as an example of how do you start to engage and get the right behavior and incentivize this. And we figured out, we did time of use rates for EV charging even a few years back, and we recognized while it provided an economic benefit, it actually created the opposite effect from a carbon and sustainability point of view, where we recognized that actually the time that actually was charged was actually dirty power, and the time it wasn't used was clean power. And it became clear as that obviously time of use and the program design is a multi-factor element, but also operating this is a multi-factor optimization that you really need to look at, and you need to combine multiple sources of data, bring them together in terms of providing that integrated view from what the consumer engagement needs, and then also what on the grid side and on the sustainability side we need to bring together. So I think another example on how you kind of need to really look at the equity, on how to put the whole equation together.
I'll jump in and just add that from a very simplistic perspective, capital will flow based on the likelihood that it's going to get repaid, because money actually doesn't care about how dirty the electricity is. That's a policy decision, and policy can be used to shape how money is deployed through various sticks and carrots. But if you strip away, if you accept that not everyone agrees on how policy should be shaped, the purity of a capital market would be that it wants to put money to work for a return. And so if you can solve the question of how that money will be repaid, and you have a reasonably well-functioning capital market to begin with, which is another underlying requirement, we have enough capital, we can probably do this. Yep. Then it's a matter of figuring out how do you bring that to bear in a way that actually makes a difference, be it in Sri Lanka, in a village, or in a low to moderate income community in a first world country. And for us, one of the keys is to, whenever possible, integrate members of that community into that shaping process. So in our case, where the low to moderate income community doesn't have a FICO score that you want to know, we've developed a program that doesn't even ask for it. The capital market still wants to make sure they're going to get paid back. So that's then where we would apply some thinking on how to approach that, and by bringing in members of the community who actually can help basically provide a bit of a, it's kind of like it's a bit of an insurance program, if you will, for that community, to make sure that if someone can't make a payment, there's a way for the capital markets to feel like, I didn't need to be bothered about that, I will get paid back. And that has this very nice circle of reducing the cost of money in the first place, because it's more likely they'll get paid back, which allows us to then sell the energy at a lower price in the first place. So it's an area where if you are addressing the equity needs, the capital markets will follow if they see like they can make a good return. And then that's where you can bring innovation into actually solving that problem.
And in this space, who do you see as leaders that we can look to and learn from that are embracing decarbonization and equity simultaneously?
You mean besides electric power?
Yeah.
So maybe let me take the first step at this and others can chime in. So I think, we have seen across the utility space as one of the target audiences here is many have started at different stages very early, some of them in the early 2000s, to put programs in place for sustainability and start to execute on them, some of them later. And I think it's important to think about where to pick up your audience and help the community to get along on the journey. And I think if we look at the different steps that there, and we at Itron, for example, formed a advisory board of many stakeholders and with leading utilities. And we recognize quickly that everybody's in a different step in the journey, but also have specific challenges to solve that are unique. Some of the, depending on what they have in their territory in terms of, rural, what kind of generation, what kind of assets they have on the distribution. And on this journey, we recognize then that there's a lot of need for education. There's a lot of need for sharing of experiences, because clearly all of us, or many of us, have made commitments to stakeholders in terms of what goals to achieve over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and don't have a complete plan on how to actually get there. Now along the journeys there are surprises, so I think the need to learn and bring the different communities together so that you can learn from the different experiences is going to be key. And we're trying to do this in our little space by basically sharing different experiences. And I think the journey, is very consistent in terms of the stages that you look at different things, either be it EV adoption, where you kind of start with make-ready programs and start to then learn the behaviors, then you start to manage the charging, etc. Or you start to create visibility on what's going on in my territory, where do I have not visibility, where do I need additional information in order to drive the change or create programs that are founded in facts. And bring the industry along. I think it's a super exciting space we are in right now, but I think it's really not really who's doing better or worse. It's more like, okay, how do we all get there and learn from each other? I think is the key here at this stage.
Just to add to what Stefan was saying, one of the things we found out fascinating was when we deployed the SEW platform, we could actually see the water usage on a daily basis on our machines. So we would actually advertise that to the people using it. And they started learning on their own that the less they use, the longer the equipment lasts actually. So they were actually saving on their own. So they would get like a liter of container, but use it the next day rather than throwing it away and coming back. So we see a lot of these unique insights into the customer behavior just by looking at the data and how they're utilizing it. And one clear example, which one of the local guys told me was, when they figured out that the battery could last for 1 day to run the machine, they wanted to make sure that it would last 2 days, so they would actually run the machine properly. So you kind of empower these people with data. They're very smart, and they'll figure out how to actually take the same thing and make it run longer. I use this example in India. Once you buy a bike, it stays with 5 generations, because they will keep running it until the aluminum has melted, basically. And so that's how they think, and that resilience allows them to actually be very creative if you provide them the data. So data is ultimately what drives us, and water is one of those very tricky problems which is not digitized. So you really don't know, water distribution, what happens. So we've looked at transmission losses, how much water is lost in a line, and then how much a building doesn't get, and how much a utility doesn't get paid back, and how do you take that information and recycle, recapture, reclaim enough water within the industrial segment to deploy it in these other areas, essentially. But ultimately, it's all because we have the data. If we didn't have the data, it would be no different than deploy the equipment and hope it keeps running.
It might be a weird thing to say, but leadership is typically thought of as like, well, the face of the person speaking or the policy that's been promulgated by a politician. And there's a lot of good utility work that is taking a leadership position. A lot of capital markets are figuring out how to do this in the ESG approach. But to play on what you just said, the leadership is actually, I think, most interesting when the customer, given the ability to empower themselves to have agency over what they're going to do with what they have at their control. Not everyone wants to spend a lot of time worrying about the gallons or the liters or the kilowatts or the kilowatt hours. But suddenly, if they have a scarce resource and they can make decisions about what to do with that, that actually contributes back. It's sort of crowdsourced leadership on actually taking the infrastructure that we have, the resources we have already, and doing more with them without a top-down approach, but a very organic, natural, bottom-up approach, which is a very hard thing to capture without the data. And also, it's unfortunate because it means there's not someone who has the desire to go out there and say, I got this through, because it's a very diffuse solution.
I think one thing I found, I didn't come from utility background, so I just learned along the way. I came from telecom, so I saw how infrastructure and all that stuff works. But if you look at it from an economy perspective, so far utilities or infrastructure related to that has been a linear economy. So you create, distribute, someone uses it, you get paid back, and nobody knows what happened at the end, actually. Mm-hmm. And then companies will deploy energy and say, okay, I made so much profits. But none of that translates into feedback into why it was actually originally created. So we believe a circular economy is what works in a resource which is constrained. So unless you know how it's being used, how it's being recaptured, what are the discharge, and why it was discharged, it doesn't work. And we have seen this in many countries. So our thesis always has been what SEW allows you to do is bring back the feedback from the customer into the originating point and say how much of this has to be recycled and how much of it is wastage. Unless you have that, I don't think you can solve this problem. So I believe these platforms allow you to create that infrastructure which says every drop you use, someone is responsible for creating it, distributing it, managing it, and paying for it. And once you do that, then everybody sees the problem differently.
And an interesting tangent to that is extending the life of infrastructure. So how can we extend the life of infrastructure, and how does that play into equity and sustainability?
I'll take a crack at that. And I think there's answers that depend on the infrastructure that's been deployed. In the United States, we have a fairly mature infrastructure from an electricity perspective. In a place where it hasn't even been built yet, think the Sahel or India, it might be a different approach where it still needs to be built. And being able to build it incrementally, where it hasn't been built yet, allows it to be done more flexibly. Where the infrastructure is already built, and you've got literally trillions of dollars and a social paradigm that everyone takes for granted with instantaneous energy, like the comments yesterday, 24/7, not 7 out of 24, which I think is a really good illustration. We take for granted that when in this country, you turn the lights on and the power's not there, and you're really surprised and mad when it isn't, is to say that if you approach policy and markets and everything else from a distributed, because it was point to many, and now to extend the life of the existing infrastructure, especially when you're not really allowed to build more point generation sources, because that takes 10 years and billions of dollars. But there's a need because someone's upset and motivated to have energy at the grid edge. If you install something at the grid edge that can actually support the existing infrastructure, you naturally get an extension of the life of that infrastructure, which means that trillions of dollars that was invested actually has even more of a repayment back into the society that allowed it to be deployed in the first place.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add to this. This is exactly the core of what we at Itron believe in, that you really need to solve the problem right there at the edge, and you need to get a lot more real time. We talked about it in other panels and other meetings over the last few days. That's what we invest in, that you get to the next level of insights using real-time, near real-time data that come engagement with the community in a different way, a lot more responsive, that you can actually enable and empower the consumer to take action at the edge, that this gives you the understanding to make decisions. Because the first time for us to solve the problem, or the first problems that will come up, are localized problems. As we talked yesterday, in many places we don't have a bulk power problem for another 5 or 10 years if we do it right. So therefore, we need to really deal with the local problems, and that means we need to figure out how to really understand what is our capacity at the edge. We understand exactly how we behave and influence behaviors to drive the programs, to leverage. People talk about V2X this morning, how to leverage the resources that now come online, not as a load, but build them into your plans. And I think it's a super exciting opportunity for us to do things differently, and I don't think any one of us can do it alone, but we need to work together to really talk with SEW from a customer engagement point of view. You need to put infrastructure in place to get the data at the right time. You need to provide the data and do the analytics, and then the control to really and optimize, and then deal with the transaction. Why not move the transactions to the edge as well to empower the consumer to save the penny right there when they want it on the day they want it?
So one of the things we saw, this is in Indonesia and countries in that region, the transmission loss on the water pipe is almost 50%. So for every gallon they create, half of it is wasted, so they're only getting paid for half of it. So after we talked to them a few times, one of the things we resolved was wherever they saw the largest transmission loss was to create water processing equipment right there. So what that allowed them to do was basically say that, because when you have a loss, the pipe leaks both ways. That means dirt goes in, dirt comes out. The question is, if I could clean it right there, or recycle and recapture, then the building which it was attached to would actually get cleaner water for a lower cost. So the utility actually now makes money, as they were losing money. The building is happy because they can actually plant their trees with the recycled water, but they're still getting clean water, and they didn't have to change any of the infrastructure. And the company which got involved in the process charges them by the liter. So if you don't use it, you don't pay for it. So this is a unique way of actually solving a problem without actually building a new grid, digging new pipes, and it's in a city which has 10 million people. You can't do any of that stuff. To do this, you have to put a pipe up someplace up in the air. It's not going to work. And I think we are long ways from power and water being wireless, so until that happens, you can't deploy cellular stuff. So the thesis I've always had is you have to take what you have and make it a little better. And so we've always believed that if you can recycle, recapture, reclaim, and renew the use, then you're taking the same resourcing and multiplying it multiple fold. And that's the best way to actually use a resource. And I think cellular guys have figured this out down to the every penny, because you can make a call or send an SMS message for free regardless of what network you're on. It's because they figured out from day one the data and how much of it's being used actually.
Perfect. I'd love to welcome any audience questions. I have a few on my list, but can we get him a mic? Or? Okay.
First of all, super inspiring, and it makes me happy and proud to be a part of this ecosystem. I have questions for both Ravi and for Stephen. Thank you. So first, Ravi, with you. When you talk about the SEW solution helping you guys predict a failure of your equipment, can you be a little bit more specific on what that data is and how you guys know it and how you respond to it?
So one of the things about our equipment is it was designed, so everything in the equipment was designed by our company actually. So every component, we patented everything in there. What happens now is the filters are designed to run, let's say, 100,000 gallons worth of water. With SEW equipment, we can actually measure the usage, the transmission rate, the pressurization of the pipes. We have a lot of sensors in there. That data is fed back to our operational team in Singapore. And they actually can then determine, based on the use case, when that specific filter needs to be replaced. So what we would do is actually we have placed filters in the villages where someone can actually go and change it on their own. It just takes a pin out and pin in. So the idea was to make it so you don't need nuts, you don't need bolts, but most importantly, you need to know when to replace it, because a bad filter is worse than a new filter, and a bad filter is worse than a really bad filter, because it's going to keep making water worse actually. So that was one of the distinct values we found. Now, this was not necessarily an economic value to us, but it's to make sure that the equipment keeps running. And that was it. So that was a huge benefit to us.
Wonderful, really wonderful. So Stephen, question to you. When you talk about capital markets being repaid, I guess my question is, one, what does that look like in that ecosystem that you talked about for lower and moderate to low income neighborhoods? But then my next question is, are carbon credits yet a way that capital markets or investors feel, are they valuable to investors yet? Is there a market for them? So it's sort of a two-prong question. Maybe answer the second one first.
Yeah, I'll say the second one first is, I wish I was, at a place in the capital markets to answer that directly and fairly. That I have seen, no. Short answer. I think there's a lot of promise and talk, and what there hasn't yet been is a market-making opportunity, because we don't have to be really aspirational, a global trading paradigm for carbon credits. There's lots of talk about it, there's lots of good ideas, and there's some local action. California passed AB 32, it's supposed to have a carbon market associated with it. There are that was, how long ago was that? Well, it was long enough ago that I wish something had happened in the meantime. We're just starting to see flexibility in those carbon markets to allow new things to start participating. SREX, for example. Originally it was set up to, AB 32 was designed to just count greenhouse gases. So if you're burning something, that's an easy way to offset your carbon. What if you're making solar behind the meter? How do you count that towards the carbon goals that any local jurisdiction has set up? So short answer, no. I think there's hopefully some things. I don't want to be Pollyanna. I hope we need more. We need a lot more.
Is there anything that this group of people in here could help or do to push that forward?
Oh, I'm sure, but that's probably a whole other panel, yeah.
I would like to chime in here on the carbon question. I'm actually very encouraged about innovation going on in the space right now. There's a lot of, actually, few startups in North America that are working on that. Carbon matching is another way to deal with that, short of having markets. And we actually do partner as Itron with a few of these, and super excited on how they actually put solutions in place that are easy to use. Clearly, there's a lot of challenges, right, to really get to, all the categories. Like especially when you think about, we talked, I think yesterday was brought up the challenges around Scope 3 and really identifying your carbon cost correctly. Real time is the right level of resolution in order to do this. But I think just the fact that there are startups in the space that are looking at this as an opportunity with the data available right now is super exciting.
Any local jurisdiction that says, here's how we're valuing it, is building that road towards actually being able to make it a useful market. But you're talking about incremental numbers. The global economy is trading in the trillions of dollars in any given commodity. Carbon doesn't come close to that, even from the, so we're really lacking scale.
Yeah.
A final question from the audience? Over here. Sarah, okay.
So my question is for both Stefan and for Stephen, right? So what we're seeing right now is there's a complete proliferation of different DR technologies that are coming into the market, and they're all giving kind of localized solutions, and people are trying out new things and replacing them. What we saw, for example, in the smart meter market was there were standard interfaces and protocols that were defined based on which you are able to achieve optima across different companies in different stages of the pipeline. Do you see that as something that companies like Itron or ElectriQ would drive in terms of common standards for DR registration, monitoring, and control, so that there's an actual possibility to extract value chain up and down the ecosystem, rather than just have different company solutions deployed as localized solutions and then replaced by something else down the line? Is that something that your companies are driving or you're looking at driving?
You want to start?
I'd say yes.
So how are you doing that?
At the end of the day, this is, there's a lot in that question. If you start with a localized solution and you don't have standards, then there's going to be a proliferation of different standards. And then one of the benefits of the digital economy is smart people can write translations between those standards. At the end of the day, the commodities which you're trying to track are pretty standard. If you excuse like liters and gallons, because the US has these weird imperial units, kilowatts and kilowatt hours, if you limit it to electricity, those are pretty universal and they're pretty fungible. So if you consume a kilowatt hour and you can track that, then the question is, what standard body did you use? What open source approach did you take? How did you decide to integrate that into your hardware and software solution so that when it is deployed, and you might deploy a a Tesla Powerwall, an electric power pod, an LG Chem battery. You choose the hardware. And then the approach I like to take is, or I think that the industry should broadly take, is don't be walled gardens, but be open. And this is an interesting interaction with then the utilities who, if it's an AMI solution, who actually owns that data?
Yeah.
And I think there's a question, and I have an opinion on it. It may not be the one that utilities share, but like, that's my data. I would like to make it available to anyone who's interested in anonymized, scrubbed, appropriately privatized or protected. But that data is a part of the public good. And it isn't treated that way. And if it was treated that way so that you could see like, and this is, I don't know if you guys get the electricity bill that shows how you're doing compared to your neighbors. It's a kind of a weird, creepy thing. And yet it's also meaningless because like, I know that my neighbors use less power than me. There's only 2 of them living there. I live pretty frugally from an electricity perspective. They go to great lengths. Like they turn off their Viper loads and I'm too lazy. I don't. I have to admit that. They got a bill that showed that they're using more than their neighbors. And they felt horrible and guilty. I was like, well, you aren't actually getting treated fairly because they aren't looking at you individually. You're just being compared against everyone else. So there's a lack of standards even in how those reports are coming back to us. So open standards, an agreement through, it could be, we have standards for UL, underwriting laboratory for the hardware. I think reporting standards are something which you could do. IEEE is something that has been involved in that and is a good organization that tries to promulgate those things. But yeah, I think it's important to have standards. If you start with the underlying commodity, energy and power as 2 simple ones, from there you can then say, all right, well, how did you count it? What's the metering? What's the error rates? And you can then go to big numbers and get some pretty good standards from that through an API, even if you just hand off the data.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, I actually totally agree with your points. Standards are needed. It needs to be open. It needs to be easy. We're looking, that's part of why we are really bring the community together. Because, we know every single one of the leading IOUs in North America has their own program to define the data models, to define their own, who is, to deal with privacy, anonymization issues, who is the custodian of the data, how to manage them through their life. Every single one is trying to figure this out. To bring the community together, for us in our advisory circles in order to define that and help them, because we know we need to provide the data in that fashion. It needs to be more than a green button or the next generation green button to really enable the next generation of service layers to bring these different islands of programs together. We're watching carefully what's happening in New York with the IDR and the program there to see whether this is going to get any traction. But clearly, even if it is or it doesn't, it is a reference point for us to see and look at in order to see where we can take this. But clearly we feel that there is an opportunity to really contribute working together to define, if there's no standards body that's going to get there fast enough for us to work together to define a de facto standard. Because we need it and it needs to be open and it needs to meet all the requirements that I think you outlined and even more from security, for, it's a big one, right? Not just consumer protection, but super big topic. And I think we're going to get there. It's not just going to enable more diverse communities to provide the demand response or DERMS programs, so to enable them with better data, but also we need to think about the service layer to also coordinate all of these aggregators to make them make sense on behalf of the grid, which is another layer of complexity we need to layer on top of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. That was a great way to tie a ribbon around the whole session, and thank you for your time.